The year is 1987. The place is Tokyo, Japan. And at the time, burgeoning little game development studio called Square was releasing game after game, but struggling to find that one big hit. One of their designers, a man named Hironobu Sakaguchi, was cranking out about a third of these lukewarm reception games, and he simply didn't find the work to be very fulfilling. Like a struggling YouTuber making a farewell video, Sakaguchi decided to make one last game before retiring from video game design. Rather than being his last game, however, this game would be such a runaway smash success that it would actually become the first game in a franchise that would become synonymous with the JRPG subgenre, to the extent that many lists regarding that subgenre often have to explicitly disqualify this franchise from inclusion just so other games can have a chance to shine. For the next few months, I will embark on a journey to review every single player installment in the main series of this franchise. But today, I am only going to be looking at the game that started it all. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy Retrospective. I don't have what it takes to make an action game. I think I'm better at telling a story. That's a quote that is ascribed to Hironobu Sakaguchi in a bonus DVD that was included with some versions of Final Fantasy X, although he's never actually seen saying it. If that's true, that may explain the aforementioned lack of satisfaction prior to making Final Fantasy. Either way, the fact of the matter is that Square, at the time, was churning out mediocre game after mediocre game, games that were, at best, making back 1.5 times their development and marketing costs. Square was in a bind, and so they banked all they had on one last project and put Sakaguchi in charge of that project. If this game failed, Square would file for bankruptcy. In other words, this was intended to be Square's final game, and therefore was called Final Fantasy. But of course, this game became such an unexpected smash hit that, rather than being their final game, it actually saved them from bankruptcy. It's a heartwarming tale, isn't it? An incredible Cinderella story about sticking it out during the tough times. Now, I want you to take this heartwarming Cinderella story and throw it all out the window because it's all complete horse shit. As it turns out, that isn't the reason behind the franchise's name at all. In a 2015 interview with Famitsu, Japan's largest video game magazine, Sakaguchi actually dismissed this tale as nothing more than an urban myth. He claims that the original name for this game was actually going to be Fighting Fantasy, but apparently that name was already taken. However, Sakaguchi really wanted the name to be abbreviated as FF for some reason, and apparently Fuck Fantasy was similarly off the table. Now, in any other story about game design behind the scenes, I would expect that to be the end of it. The first game's director, who I would assume to be the ultimate authority of what goes on behind the scenes, has explicitly disavowed an urban myth for which there has never been any official source. Honestly, I trust the word of the guy who actually founded the franchise over some internet rumor that I cannot trace to any official source. Except in this case, I honestly can trace it to an official source. In fact, I can trace this urban myth to the official source. In the aforementioned Beyond Final Fantasy DVD, Sakaguchi states what I mentioned earlier, that he was unsatisfied with his work, and so this game was called Final because it was indeed meant to be the final game for Sakaguchi himself. Okay, sure, that's not the same as Square being one failed game away from bankruptcy, but it still explicitly contradicts what he will go on to say in his 2015 Famitsu interview, that the word final was decided upon rather arbitrarily since they wanted it to be abbreviated FF, and their first choice for a name was already taken. Bear in mind that this isn't one guy's account of what happened contradicting another guy's account. Both of these stories come directly from the lips of the man himself, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and they cannot both be true at the same time. So alas, it appears as if the true source of the name will forever be lost to history, since the man whose word supersedes all other accounts of the story cannot himself keep his story straight. In any event, Square initially provided enough funding for 7 developers, with Sakaguchi presiding over the other 6. These 7 developers were called the A-Team.
And if you can find them, maybe you can hire the A-Team.
And they got top billing in the in-game credits after you complete the first chapter of the game's story. About halfway through development, Square saw some promise with this game, and decided to quadruple the size of the development team, bringing in 20 extra guys, thereby breaking the total size of the development team from 7 to 27. These extra guys, known unofficially as the B-Team, were not warmly welcomed by the A-Team. The A-Team felt kind of jealous that Square didn't have enough faith in them to get the job done on their own, and they perceived the B-Team as replacing them, rather than supplementing their work. It has never been confirmed whether that was indeed Square's intention with bringing in the B-Team, but regardless, the A-Team took it as a sign that they really needed to buckle down and give it their all to save their jobs. Whether their extra hard work impressed Square enough to keep them on board, or whether they already had job security and were just worrying about nothing, the fact of the matter is that the A-Team poured its heart and soul into this game. So that begs the question, did their hard work pay off? Well, commercially speaking, of course it did. But is this game still good more than 30 years later? Let's find out by first discussing the first thing you do in the game. Create your character. First thing that really pissed me off about this game is the controls for the character creation menu. Basically, you start the game by selecting either Continue or New Game, the former which loads a previously saved game. Upon selecting New Game, we first have to create our characters, and right off the bat I am at my wit's end. So, instead of starting off with just one character and growing your party as the game progresses, you instead begin the game with all 4 of your party members, and you never get any more. That's fine, it's different than what I'm used to, but it's still an alright system. However, creating these characters is a pain in the ass. You can't move on to other characters until you finish creating your first character. The D-pad doesn't allow you to select which character you want to modify. Instead, it just cycles through the various classes you can roll. It really should have given you the ability to select a character with the D-pad, and then use the A button to enter a sub-menu. That would have made things much more intuitive. However, even the character creation system is a pretty shallow. In fact, it would be generous to call this character creation system threadbare. You really can only select 2 things about your character. You can select which class your character is from a list of 6 potential classes, and then you can name your character, but you're limited to 4 characters per name. You cannot customize your character's appearances either. Instead, you are locked into the preset character model for any given class. Now, I understand that they were working with some pretty limited hardware, so I definitely can understand not giving us Code Vein levels of character customization. But seriously, 4 letters to a name and only 6 classes? Come on, Sakaguchi, you can do a little better than that. One member of the A-Team, Akitoshi Kawazu, am I pronouncing that right? Leave a comment, had campaigned hard for the player's ability to create their own characters, stating, "The fun in an RPG begins when you create a character." And yet, this was apparently considered creating your own character by 1987 standards. These characters are completely faceless. They have no character, no backstory, no history whatsoever. Who they are, where they came from, how they came to be together, how they came to realize they were the Light Warriors of Prophecy, and how they came into possession of the 4 orbs is all left completely ambiguous. I suppose you could argue that this frees up the player to decide on backstories for themselves, but honestly, what's the point? The characters never interact with the world except as part of their quest to save the world. There are no side quests and no opportunities for you to express your own personality in-game, not even through dialogue. So there's really no point in coming up with a backstory for your characters, since that backstory will never come into play in this game. It hardly even qualifies as a role-playing game, since you never get a chance to do any role-playing in it. So anyway, I decided to go with a White Mage, Fighter, Thief, and Black Mage. Why that combination? Because the game tells you absolutely fuck all about what each class entails, and I wanted to have a nice spread of classes so I could see as much of the game as possible on a single playthrough. I can understand, due to the limitations of the hardware, not giving me a full in-game tutorial where they teach me every class and optimal playstyle. But they should have, at the very least, given me the rundown on how each class works. I mean, there's only 6 of them, so it wouldn't have taken up very much space in the instruction manual. But no, the instruction manual for this game just says, as you learn more about the game, you will find the characters that will work best for you. Even the instruction manual, which literally exists for the sole purpose of teaching the players how to play the game, actually refuses to teach the players how to play the game, which is literally the only thing it exists to do. In fact, this was yet another conscious choice on Kawazu's part. In the same interview where he explained his belief in creating your own character, he also said the idea was to just let people figure things out. If you make a party of all white mages, you probably can't clear the game. But we weren't worried about that affecting the balance or anything like that. Wow. Not giving a damn about game balance, and just plopping the player directly into the death pit without any sense of direction. I'm sure that would go over well in 2020. And let me tell you, this game is not balanced with exploration in mind. When I get a new weapon or a piece of armor, I have no way of knowing which of my characters can and can't equip it. So whenever I get a new item, my first order of business is to try to equip the item on one of my characters, and if I can't equip it on them, I go back and trade the item to give it to another guy and attempt to equip it on him until I eventually find a guy who I can equip the item on. This is not fun, it's just tedious. Hell, it's even less fun than the trial and error gameplay of the original Legend of Zelda on NES. That game has also not aged well at all, but at least with that game your trial and error gameplay was based on exploring the overworld, seeing which paths you can take, which paths your newest items can unlock. You have a lantern that spits fire, so now you can burn shit. Let's see what kind of shit I can burn to open up new paths. While such trial and error gameplay, with absolutely no sense of direction whatsoever, is not considered fun by today's standards, it at least has more of a sense of exploration to it than just navigating the blue and white text-only menus to see which of my guys can equip this new piece of armor. So now that I've played this game once, and spoiler alert, I do not have any desire to play it again, here's my breakdown of the 4 classes that I actually used. The Black Mage does offensive magic, the White Mage focuses on protective and restorative spells. The Fighter is your primary DPS character, and the Thief is, well, he's basically just a shittier version of the Fighter. Like the Fighter, he can't use spells, but there are also several weapons and pieces of armor that the Fighter can equip that the Thief can't. So he's basically just a shit fighter. So I suppose it's ironically appropriate that I named my Thief Shit. The first thing you'll notice about this game's aesthetic presentation is just how ear-splitting the game's background music is. When you start a new game, your first order of business is to enter the castle of the nearby city and get your first quest from the king. When you enter the castle, this is the music that plays. If I had a dog, he would probably look like this right now. And the score never gets good. There are some songs that I find to be slightly less ear-splitting than the others, or maybe I just came down with Stockholm Syndrome with the soundtrack, but it was all terrible from beginning to end. Now, before any of you say that this was simply due to the limitations of the hardware, no it isn't. Plenty of games on NES had awesome scores, many of which even the children of today can instantly recognize. Let's not forget this totally danceable tune from Capcom. Or this creepy but adrenaline-pumping tune from Konami. Or this song from Nintendo that invokes a sense of wonder and exploration. And of course, we can't talk about NES music without talking about this absolutely legendary piece. So no, the problem isn't that this game is bottlenecked by the hardware it was on. The problem is that Nobuyo Uematsu, the musician who wrote this game's score, is simply a shit composer. What's even more pathetic is that this game doesn't even know what music to use, even when presented with superior alternatives within its own game. What do I mean by that? Well, forget for a minute that you've ever played this game before, and you have no idea what's in it. Here, let me play you a little jingle from this game without any visuals on screen. What does that sound like to you? Well, to me, this sounds like something important to the game just happened. Like perhaps I had just collected one of the MacGuffins to advance the plot after defeating the boss that guarded it. Well, nope. This is just the sound that plays when you sleep at an inn and save your game. You know what happens when you actually collect one of the crystals after defeating a main boss? This happens. Wow, I must admit that was very, very anticlimactic. When Link gets a piece of the Triforce, he holds it over his head in triumph. When Mario finishes a level, he slides down a flagpole and possibly fireworks happen. With Final Fantasy, you beat a boss and get a crystal, phew, trapezoid, blink and you'll miss it. Meanwhile, the actual triumphant music comes when you do the most mundane of things. What's next? Does actually defeating the final boss give a literal yawn sound effect, while somebody cutting a fart is accompanied by a 100-person choir singing O Fortuna? Of course, the graphics do not make up for this game's terrible audio. Sure, the graphics aren't a complete eyesore, but neither are they anything to write home about. With the exception of the towns and settlements, which are extremely sparse, the overworld really only has 8 different types of terrain. Grassy plains, forests, rivers, ocean, desert, swampland, and mountains. The problem is that these 8 terrains get reused over and over again over a world map that is 256 by 256 tiles. So these 8 tiles wear out their welcome almost immediately. In fact, rivers and desert are the only 2 types of terrain you don't see in literally the first chapter of the game. It really makes it a pain in the ass to try and keep track of where the hell you are. To put this in perspective, let's look at another game for the NES that also boasted open world exploration. Again, let's turn to The Legend of Zelda. Sure, that game reused a lot of graphical assets, it was limited by the hardware after all, but the patterns in which it used them were clearly placed in strategic locations to the point where, with enough experience with the game, you could effectively deduce where you were. For example, where am I here? Oh, I'm 1 screen north of my starting position. Now where am I? Oh, I'm 2 screens east of the entrance to the first dungeon. Now let's take a look at Final Fantasy. In this shot, where am I relative to, say, the city of Coneria where I started the game? I'm sure some of you hardcore fans of this game can tell me, but you really have to have grown up with this game to be able to tell. The overworld is really nothing but bland, featureless, nondescript terrain, and it really wears on you. In addition to every screen in The Legend of Zelda having a unique appearance, that game also gave you a radar. A very primitive radar, mind you, but still one that helped you keep track of where you were in relation to the rest of the game. With Final Fantasy, you don't get diddly-dick. You find yourself wandering around the overworld like a chicken with your head cut off, just trying to figure out where the hell you are, let alone where you're supposed to go? Well, you're just shit out of luck. The inside of the towns aren't much better. The only one that kinda stands out is this one due to it looking ransacked. Every other town looks almost exactly the same except for a different layout of its commercial buildings. I mean, I get that there are some hardware limitations, but you managed to make this place look unique, so clearly you know how to make this stuff look unique. Of course, the mere fact that this one town looks run down also draws attention to another failing of the graphics. Supposedly, the world is starting to rot. However, the world map honestly doesn't appear to be all that rotten. In fact, barring the crises such as the Princess of Coneria being kidnapped or the Prince of Elfland being put into an eternal slumber, the daily lives of the common folk of this game seem to be going off without a hitch. You couldn't have given us some rotten variants of the 8 different terrain tiles? Perhaps after each chapter in the game, some tiles in the overworld would convert to their rotten variants to show that the world is ending? This is one of the rules of writing that regulars on my channel know I like to bring up once in a while. Show, don't tell. Instead of just having some old farts stand around in a circle and tell me how the earth is rotting away, why don't you actually show it rotting? As an example of another NES game that did this much better, let's once again turn to The Legend of Zelda. When Nintendo finally released the official Zelda timeline, it was revealed that this game takes place after the events of Ocarina of Time, but in a timeline where Ganon was actually victorious over Ocarina of Time Link, and was allowed to weave his evil craft for quite a while. So, with that knowledge in mind, let's take a look at the overworld of this game and see how it conveys that general atmosphere. The land is essentially stripped bare. A few bridges and statues dot the landscape as the last remnants of a once glorious civilization that has been completely laid to ruin. The last bastions of humanity are forced to live in underground caves and holes as the surface is crawling with monsters. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how you visually convey the sense of a dying world. Final Fantasy came out in Japan nearly 2 years after The Legend of Zelda, so you can't say there was no precedent back then. The only thing about this game's aesthetic presentation that I actually kinda like is the monsters. You don't see them in the overworld, but you do see them in battle. Sure, some of them are just palette swaps of other enemies, but there are quite a few enemies on display here, and especially considering that they take up only a small portion of a screen that was originally designed for a 256 by 240 resolution TV, they have a surprising amount of detail put into their designs. Now, just imagine if the A-Team had put that much effort into making the overworld and towns look nice. It's a damn shame that they go and ruin the one good thing about the game's graphics through overexposure, but to explain what I mean by that, we have to discuss I feel like Final Fantasy was ahead of its time in all the wrong ways. What do I mean by that? Well, you know how, in the past few years, game developers seem to be obsessed with creating the biggest maps possible? Like how 2019's Ghost Recon Breakpoint was over 2,000 square kilometers, but all that really did was make it take longer to get anything done, because rather than actually provide us with 2,000 square kilometers worth of stuff to do, they instead just made about 6 or 7 things to do, and then just copy and pasted them about 500,000 times each. Well, I get that feeling from this game. The world map is 256 by 256 tiles, which was an enormous overworld for its time, and yet it's completely empty. Except instead of 6 or 7 things to do, copy and pasted about 500,000 times each, they instead just gave us one thing to do. Random battles. Whenever you enter a new tile, there's a random chance you'll be met with an enemy that you can either fight or run away from. That's it. That's literally the only thing you can do in this game as you're making the long-ass trek from one city to the next. Oh sure, you occasionally need to acquire some items in order to make it past certain barriers, but there's no actual gameplay to that. There are only 2 ways you can acquire items to advance the plot. You can either open the chest and get the thing, or you can talk to a guy and get the thing. No quest, no ingenuity, no thinking outside the box. You don't even need to navigate any dialogue trees to convince the guy to hand over the thing. Every time I needed to get a thing, I literally just walked up to the guy and pressed the A button, and boom, I had the thing. The NPCs who have things in this game are literally nothing more than chests that move. So for the most part, you really only have random battles to look forward to when you're in the overworld, and let me tell you, this game got really carried away with how often these random battles occur. Perhaps in an attempt to compensate for the lack of content in the overworld, Sakaguchi couldn't let us go more than a few seconds without encountering another enemy. Here, I just defeated an enemy, and one of my guys is down, so I need to get back to a city and get him revived by a clinic. Then, this happens. Seriously, Sakaguchi? I didn't even have time to fart and I'm already in another fight. Of course, I wouldn't mind the battles so frequently if I felt they were fun, engaging, and well-balanced. Sadly, that is not the case. One thing I noticed early on about this game that I felt had the potential to be interesting was that the combat system was kind of a pseudo-CRPG system. In later RPGs, you would select a character's attack, then he would perform the attack, then the enemy would take damage, and then I would go through that same cycle with the next character. But here, I select my top guy's attack, then I select an attack for the next guy, and then the third guy, and then the bottom guy. Then, after I've selected all 4 attacks, my characters and the enemies all take their turns delivering the attacks. Because of this, I feel it is more accurate to say that this game has a wave-based combat system rather than a turn-based combat system. However, what kills this pseudo-CRPG system is that the turn order, once the actual wave of combat starts, seems to be dictated at complete random. In later RPGs, turn order would be dictated by a speed stat. The characters with the higher speed stat would get to attack first, and if you had twice the speed of another character or more, you could attack twice before that guy got to attack once. But here, turn order is entirely random. Why is that a problem? Well, because it often means that my carefully laid attack strategies often go completely to shit through no fault of my own. Take, for example, this moment. My African mage is in desperate need of healing, so I assign my Caucasian mage to use the cure spell on the African mage. Well, once the next combat wave starts, an enemy attacks the African mage again and he goes down. So when the Caucasian mage casts his cure spell, it has no effect. If I had known that this was going to be the turn order for that wave, I would have instead used the life spell, not the cure spell, since that's what you need to bring the dead people back to life. Instead, I just wasted a spell point because the turn order was random. That is not fun! Nobody likes to have their best laid plans get screwed over by RNG. This is why Mario Party is often called the Friendship Killer. Because the combat was so frustrating, and because I couldn't go 6 steps without another fight breaking out, I honestly just decided to use some Game Genie codes to remove random battles from the overworld altogether, and reduce the battles inside the dungeons so that they only happened once in a while, and dramatically increase the experience I earned from each battle to ensure I was still leveling up enough to be able to defeat the bosses. However, using those Game Genie codes just makes it even more apparent just how empty the world is. The dungeons literally just become bland, empty, featureless mazes at that point. The only dungeon I felt had a potentially interesting concept to it was the Volcano Dungeon. There were some tiles of what I'm going to assume are molten magma, and if you step on them, all 4 of your guys take damage, forcing you to optimize your movement to minimize your damage. Unfortunately, on a first-time playthrough, you're not really gonna know what's the most direct path to the end of the dungeon, so you often find yourself taking superfluous damage simply because you're trying to figure out where to go. Now, to an extent, I can understand why Square couldn't add some very complex puzzles into these dungeons to help break up the monotony. After all, even The Legend of Zelda, a franchise which is almost wholly dependent on puzzle solving in dungeons, still had very simple puzzles in its original outing, mostly amounting to pushing a single block, a single space in one direction. So, to an extent, I suppose Square really didn't have much of a choice. I mean, it's not like there's something out there that's like a puzzle but can be conveyed in a text-only medium. Alas, such a thing only seems to exist in the realm of dreams. As for the spells, that's one aspect of combat that I kind of have a love-hate relationship with. The turn order BS I just hate, but the magic I both love and hate. For one, I kind of like the way this game keeps track of spell points for each tier of spells separately. In modern RPGs, you have one magic pool. You can increase your maximum magic by leveling up, but you only ever have one magic pool. Higher tier spells cost more magic to cast as a means of balancing out how powerful they are. But this game actually has 8 different tiers of spells that your mages can learn, and each tier has a separate number of spell points attached to it. This is definitely an interesting concept, and I'm kind of sad that this didn't become normalized and become an equally valid alternative way to do magic in an RPG. Instead, the single magic pool system is the only real norm nowadays. I'm not saying the genre should have adopted this instead of the single magic pool system. I'm saying that I wish the genre had evolved to have both of these as alternative ways to handle it. Kind of like how, when it comes to the protagonist, the customizable character where you can write your own backstory and personality, and the protagonist with a preset backstory and personality, are both equally valid ways of doing a player character, rather than one simply being the way it used to be, while the other is the current standard. However, I absolutely despise how this game doesn't tell you what each spell does. Now granted, the instruction manual that came with this game does tell you what each spell does, but who consults the instruction manual for a game anymore? I honestly completed this entire game before I even checked out the instruction manual. Now, you could argue that this is just me applying 2020 standards of gaming to a game that was released more than 30 years ago, so you could argue that this isn't a fair comparison. But at the same time, used games and video game rentals were still common back then, and those types of transactions almost never had the instruction manuals with them. So I still maintain that the game had a duty to adequately communicate to its audience what each spell does in-game. Besides, for the second and third generation of consoles, games were typically so simple that you didn't need the instruction manual, and from the 7th generation and onward, most games included robust in-game tutorials, not to mention you already had ubiquitous online guides. So it was only the 16-bit era and all the way through the PS2 era that actually required instruction manuals. In fact, upon reading the instruction manual, I found that it practically served as a walkthrough for the entire first half of the game. All the way up until you get the airship, the instruction manual actually provides step-by-step instructions on how to get up to that point in the game. Prior to the internet, most games had those kinds of in-depth strategy guides, but they were usually sold separately. This was supposedly the instruction manual that actually came standard with the game. It just seems weird that they would not only provide you with this guide for free, but only stop halfway. Considering that Sakaguchi wanted the players to figure things out for themselves, it just seems weird that they did this. So, the world is somehow tied to these 4 orbs that the 4 main characters are carrying. If the orbs are shining, the world is healthy, but if they're dark, the world is rotting into nothingness. Not that this is ever shown in-game, see earlier in this video for details. As I said before, how the 4 protagonists got hold of these orbs is left entirely up in the air, and yet this honestly needs an explanation. If the orbs are so important that they are literally tied to the fate of the world, then why aren't these orbs kept under the highest security by the most powerful government in the world? I mean, just imagine if one of these orbs got destroyed. What would happen to the world and/or its respective element then? And frankly, it's honestly a miracle that these orbs don't get destroyed during one of the Light Warrior's many, random battles. Probably due to the technological limitations of the time, everyone is short and to the point in this game. Whenever you talk to an NPC, they convey everything they're meant to convey in one dialogue box. This means there's almost no opportunity for characters to actually show any personality, and no opportunity for the story to actually show rather than tell its main plot points. Gee, I wonder what this city's crisis is. Gee, I wonder what I need to wake this guy up. The game's instruction manual advises you to talk to everyone you meet to get valuable information, but honestly, I don't buy it. Take, for example, this chick, who says that she's a stripper. What does that have to do with the main plot? How does that help me on my quest? Given the limited amount of cartridge space, you would think that every NPC would contribute a piece of the puzzle, but most of these NPCs just seem to be there to fill up space. Despite the overworld's map's open-ended design, the game is actually quite linear. Until you get the airship, there's really only one thing you can do at any given point in time to progress the story. At the start of the game, the only thing you can do is to go after Garland and rescue the princess. Once you do that, a bridge is built to let you access the next section of the map, but the only thing you can do at that point is visit this town, take care of the pirates, and take their ship. Now, you'd think that now that you have access to the high seas, the map would really open up. But nope. You can only plant your boat at designated docks, which means there's only one place that you can currently go, Elfland, which, as the name suggests, is home to the trolls, because what else would you expect to find in a place called Elfland? Then you open up a canal to give you access to another section of the seas, and then you get the canoe, and then finally, you get the airship. Then, and only then, does the entire map get opened up. The problem with all of these things you do to open up each section of the map is that none of these things feel interconnected. The second city to enter is overrun with pirates. Well, it sure is a good thing those pirates gave us an excuse to kick their asses, so they'll hand over their ship in compensation. How else were we going to get a vessel so we could get to the rest of the map and complete our quest? Were these pirates part of the prophecy or something? Because the game never states or even implies that they were acting pursuant to the prophecy. For a game that is so linear in its progression, it has a surprising amount of backtracking to it. There's only one way to advance the plot at any given time, and yet, it's almost never obvious what you need to do. Take, for example, this moment. I had just finished up with Elfland and woken the prince from his eternal slumber. I'm given some key, so what do I do with this key? Now, years and years of playing games myself has told me that the place I'm supposed to use this key is going to be in close proximity to the place I got the key. So apparently, somewhere in Elfland, maybe? Nope, I'm supposed to go all the way back to Coneria, the first city, and plunder that king's treasure room for some TNT. Because that's not going to get me thrown in the Coneria dungeon, is it? By the way, this TNT is the only instance of modern technology in this otherwise purely fantasy setting. Anyway, this backtracking would have been a pain in the ass even if I already knew exactly where to go, seeing as I tend to get attacked by monsters every 6 seconds, but playing this game for the first time and not knowing what to do? Fuck that shit. Eventually, you get a canoe that you can use to cross the rivers. The guy who gives you the canoe is one of 12 old farts who stand in a circle. These old farts say that as you make progress on your quest, you can come to them for more information about your quest. So it seems that finally we're going to get an in-game sense of direction, rather than being expected to defer to the the instruction manual. But nope, after I defeated the Fire Fiend, I returned to these old farts to see if they can offer me any clues about what to do next. Nope, they still have the same dialogue as before. It's only after you defeat all 4 fiends that you finally get some new info from these old farts. When you finally get some new dialogue, this fantasy story starts to go completely off the rails. Now, at the very end, Sakaguchi decides to shoehorn in a time travel subplot to this story. Oh my god. Time travel is one of the most complicated genres of fiction in existence. So to fully explain why this is such a bad move on Sakaguchi's part, I'm going to need an entire section of this video to explain everything. This leads me to... To call time travel complicated would be an understatement. Telling this kind of story requires keeping up with even the most seemingly trivial of details. The slightest miscalculation in your story can lead to your audience coming at you with reckless abandon over things that should have led to this or that cause and effect chain. Details that, in any other type of story, could easily just be hand-waved as not being very important, suddenly become huge plot holes when time travel gets introduced. Just as a single example of this kind of triviality I'm talking about, let's look at Dragon Ball Z. A commonly cited plot hole in that show is that Cell says that he didn't bother collecting future Trunks' DNA since the computer determined it already had enough Saiyan DNA for its project. However, in Cell's timeline, it would have been Goku returning to Earth via instant transmission who defeated Frieza. Now, in any other type of story, we wouldn't be questioning it. We saw ourselves that it was Trunks who defeated Frieza, so what's the big deal? But once you introduce time travel into the story, that seemingly insignificant detail suddenly forms the basis for a huge plot hole. A serious time travel story requires careful attention to detail and keeping up with minute logistics. You really need to develop the entire story from the outset with time travel in mind in order for it to work. Hell, if you're good, you can even have time travel pulling the strings behind the scenes, and the audience won't even know it's happening until the moment you decide to reveal that it was time travel all along. One story that executed this type of plot reveal flawlessly is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. All throughout the story, and especially leading up to the climax, there were a lot of things happening in that story that didn't make any sense, like the rock coming from nowhere. However, it suddenly made sense when we realized that it was time travel all along. Unfortunately, this game doesn't even attempt to cause this time travel subplot to actually make sense. Not only that, but it honestly just feels way too complicated for the story that has been told up until now. Up until this point, the story has been pretty straightforward and simple. Every crisis has had an immediately obvious resolution. The conflict here is that the city has been overrun by pirates. The resolution to that conflict is, we go and kick the pirates' asses. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. But now we've suddenly got time travel involved. That feels like the equivalent of an episode of Dora the Explorer, where the majority of the story plays out like a typical Dora the Explorer episode, teaching the kids typical preschool stuff, but then she tries to squeeze in a quick lesson in quantum mechanics in the last 2 minutes of the episode. So let's take a few minutes to discuss just some of the questions and plot holes left unsolved by this entirely unnecessary shoehorning of time travel into this story. First of all, it turns out that Chaos is actually Garland, the first boss of the game. Instead of being a villain of the week to be defeated and moved past never to be seen again, kind of like Astos or the Pirates, it turns out that Garland was the evil mastermind this whole time. However, he says that he survived his battle with you because the fiends sent him back in time. How does that save him? Time travel can retroactively prevent a murder from happening in the first place, but that usually requires the time traveler to go back to the time and place of the murder and stop the killer from doing the deed. Since when has the murder victim been able to be brought back to life just by having his dead body be sent back in time? And it's not even like this is a past version of him because he actually references the battle you had with him. Second, Garland references a time loop. He will go back in time, and the fiends forward in time, and wait 2,000 years before doing this all over again. Presumably, he has done this song and dance many times before. If that were the case, then that should mean that the Light Warriors are destined to fail in their mission to slay Chaos. After all, they've already failed many times in this time loop, so they must fail here because they've already failed in the past. When your destiny is predetermined because of time travel, the only thing that typically can change history is more time travel. But that's not what actually happens here. And yet, despite this, the Light Warriors canonically defeat chaos and restore peace to their world. So what gives? And you know what? I was about to simply leave it at that and say that Sakaguchi just completely dropped the ball by shoehorning this time travel into the story. But believe it or not, just as I was writing the very last paragraph of the script, a theory popped into my head that would actually cause this to make some kind of sense. Now, bear in mind that this is pure headcanon at this point. Sakaguchi clearly did not put any thought into how this time travel would work in his story, so my theory is almost certainly not canon. That said, what if this time loop is governed by a combination of the predestination paradox and the uncertainty principle? For those who don't know, the uncertainty principle is a real-life theory of physics created by legendary physicist Max Planck. And it's basically a big sciencey way of saying there's some things in life that are just random, so there's no point trying to predict them. So, what if, in this game's time loop, everything that happened in the time loop is predestined to still happen, but anything that is normally governed by the uncertainty principle would still be governed by the uncertainty principle? So the Light Warriors are still predestined to face off against chaos as part of this time loop, but the outcome of the battle would still be dependent on a wide variety of factors, many of which would be uncertain. You are predestined to roll the dice, but the outcome of the dice roll will still vary with each cycle of the time loop. So eventually, the Light Warriors will get a favorable outcome to the battle with chaos, thereby breaking the time loop. It may take 1 trillion cycles, but eventually, the Light Warriors will get a favorable rolling of the dice and finally defeat chaos and break the loop. However, just to reiterate, nothing I just postulated is already canon in this game. I am clearly putting way more thought into this than Sakaguchi ever did. Unfortunately, this game did not need time travel in it. It would have been just fine if chaos was located in some cave that I had previously not explored without me having to travel back in time 2,000 years. Throwing in time travel just for a lark does nothing to enhance the story. All it does is leave us with about a dozen plot holes and unanswered questions that this game simply can't answer for us because there's just no way for the story to fit this extremely complex subplot in at this late a point. So overall, to say that the time travel in this game is poorly handled is an understatement. In conclusion, I quite honestly am surprised that this game was the success that it was. I am certainly willing to cut it some slack due to the technological limitations of its time, but even giving the game that much benefit of the doubt, it still fails on multiple counts, as demonstrated by comparing it side by side with other games from the same console generation that had the same limitations. The music is ear-splitting. The overworld is empty except for spamming random battles every 6 seconds, yet is way bigger than it actually needs to be. The battle system is clunky and way too dependent on RNG, and then to rub salt in the wound, the story tries to shoehorn in a time travel subplot at the last minute. I'm happy for Sakaguchi that this game was a success, but I honestly do not feel it deserves to be the success that it was. I do not do absolute scores on a scale of 1 to 10. However, if I did, this game would definitely get less than a 5 from me. It has aged like a glass of room temperature milk left out on the shelf for a whole year. Now for the rankings. Just like with my Splinter Cell Retrospective series, I will rank each game in comparison to all the other games I've played. Only instead of 6 games in the main series, I instead have 15 of them to rank with each other. Right now, Final Fantasy I is the only game I've played and reviewed, so it simultaneously occupies the top and bottom score on the list. Next time, I will do the second game in the series, Final Fantasy II. However, I will not be reviewing an English ROM of the NES version of this game. Instead, I will be reviewing the version that was the first time this game was released in an official capacity in North America. Final Fantasy Origins on the PlayStation 1. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoy my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!